I'm incredibly excited to welcome Dr. Erick Hung today to speak to us about time management. Dr. Hung is a professor of clinical psychiatry in the UCSF Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and is a member of the UCSF Academy of Medical Educators. He's the Associate Dean for Students in the UCSF School of Medicine. And prior to joining the Dean's team, he served as the Program Director of the Adult Psychiatry Residency Training Program from 2012 to 2022, and the Director of Curricular Affairs for GME for the UCSF School of Medicine from 2015 to 2022. He completed his medical school, psychiatry residency, and forensic psychiatry fellowship training at UCSF and joined the faculty in 2009. He actively teaches in the areas of risk assessment, medical education, forensic psychiatry, leadership, and ethics. His interests include primary care and mental health integration, the interface between mental health and the legal system, interprofessional collaboration and training, HIV psychiatry, LGBTQ mental health, and medical education. His educational scholarship includes interests related to competency-based assessment, faculty development, and near-peer learning in the workplace setting. So we might all wonder how Dr. Hung gets all of this accomplished. And he's here to talk to us today about that very subject, time management for academic medicine, strategies for success. So with that, thank you for speaking with us today, and we look forward to hearing all about how to better manage our time.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Christina, for that very warm introduction. It's great to see everyone and to see some familiar faces out there. So thanks for having me participate in the GME College series. I know that the series has been really important for residents and for fellows and for faculty and for staff. And one topic that comes up over and over again is, I don't have time in my day. So how do I get some time back? And that often leads one to think about time management. Just out of curiosity, how many people have attended or participated in some kind of a time management workshop before? Feel free for those that have their cameras off and just raise your hand on Zoom or thumbs up. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Christina. So a couple of people, and one thing that I certainly have noticed during my time at UCSF, as Christina mentioned, I was a trainee here, then have been on faculty, is that you can always learn tips and tricks in terms of managing your time. I remember when I was a junior faculty member, it was actually my first year on faculty. There was a faculty development series that offered a workshop on time management. And back then, like many busy staff members or faculty members or trainees, I signed up for the time management session and was really excited to go to it. And then, of course, the day of the session had a very busy clinic. And halfway through clinic said, I don't have time to go to a time management workshop. I just super stressed right now. And so I almost didn't go, but the better half of me said, Eric, just get to this time management workshop. I'm sure you'll learn something. And I did. And that workshop really transformed the way that I think about managing my time and managing projects and tasks. And since then, I've become a little bit of a time management junkie in that I attended lots of time management workshops. I've kind of done a deep dive in the literature, not only in healthcare, but also in other industries around how to think about time management. And what I'm going to share today is a lot of what the literature would suggest and inform us as we think about time management in academic medicine and academic healthcare settings. And really kind of summarizes sort of 5 decades worth of the literature and also puts some of it into some more context for us working in a healthcare environment. So with that, I'm going to share my slides. I would encourage people, if you have your cameras off, feel free to be as interactive as possible. Use the chat liberally. For those that have their cameras on, it's great to see your faces. Sari, it's so good to see your face. And we'll learn together. Okay, The other thing that I would ask is that there shouldn't ever be one person that is giving you the gospel of like how to manage your time. You have to do things that work for you and work for your style. And so I would encourage all of us just to throw ideas and tips or things that have gotten us stuck into the chat, or when we have time at the end for discussion, because we're also going to learn together about what has worked for us and to learn a little bit more about some of those strategies as a group. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So time management. I will say that whether you are a staff member or faculty member or a trainee working in the healthcare environment, one thing that is often the case is that we feel like we never have enough time in our days. And whether you are taking care of patients, teaching or doing staff development or faculty development for others, whether you are trying to juggle meetings, whether you are trying to complete online modules that UCSF wants you to complete, whether you're trying to think about how do you sort of think about systems and improve those systems through QI work, or pursuing research and scholarship, or putting together presentations, or thinking about catching up on articles or journals or things that you want to read, or being able to have conversations, mentoring meetings, sponsoring sessions with others, or just thinking about how to live in the Bay Area and finding time to eat, finding time to exercise, finding time, again, to do all the things that we're not only supposed to do, but that we want to do, like catching up on good sleep, or practicing whatever activities bring us towards center. Thing that we don't have in the day is more time. And so when you think about time management, it's really all about trying to find ways to be more productive, efficient, or wise in the time that you do spend, knowing that work and life and that kind of balance between the two, or what I would argue is really about the integration of the two, is something that is a skill, like any other skill that takes time to cultivate and to nurture and to practice and to learn from and to practice some more. So if you can put into the chat, and I'll take a look at the chat as we go, what are some time management issues that you've struggled with? Just take a second to reflect on that and put some of the things that you have struggled with into the chat. Give everyone just a second to do that. And as people are putting a thought or two into the chat, I'll just share out loud, especially for those that are watching this recording after this session. Thank you, Saria, for kicking us off. Yeah, so trying to get work done by a deadline when you have to collaborate with other people and they're just not getting back to you. Excellent. Becky, thank you for sharing when you have competing priorities that have the same deadline. Great. Sarah shares prioritizing when you can't get everything on your plate done and trying to think about what's most important and what's most important. A really common, I think, dilemma that a lot of people find themselves in. Susanna, thank you for sharing that. Trying to do too much, so having too much on your plate to begin with. All right, well, these are great, and we'll keep them in mind. For those that haven't had a chance to put stuff into the chat, feel free, throughout the session to put some situations that you find challenging in terms of managing your time. So for our time together, I have sort of 5 big things that I'd like us to walk away from this session with. One is I'd like for us to just think about some big picture strategies for how to manage time in an academic healthcare setting. And to do so, we're going to cover 4 really important objectives that will help us get closer towards better time management. We're going to discuss approaches to important versus not important, and then urgent versus not urgent tasks, which gets at, I think, some of the dilemmas that people share around how do I actually prioritize things, and is there a framework for thinking about how do I prioritize things? We're going to appreciate the limits of multitasking. We all do it. In fact, I'm guessing that many of you are multitasking right now as we're sitting here in a time management workshop. And I'm going to try to share some evidence with you that there are limitations of multitasking. They don't necessarily keep us fully present. And they also have the false, I think, perception that we're getting more things done when we actually might not be getting as much done as we think we are. So we'll see a little bit of the data around multitasking. For those that have shared tasks with others, we're going to discuss some strategies for how to manage your time effectively with others when you're working in a team. And then last but not least, we're going to appreciate some of the pitfalls related to perfectionism. Perfectionism can be a big enemy towards time management. And so we'll spend some time in that space. For anyone who's really interested in going a little bit deeper, health professions education has some literature around time management. It's not as much as the business world. And so for anyone who's a fan of the Harvard Business Review, the Harvard Business Review often puts out these kind of compilations of really good topics. And one of their topics in 2018 was how to manage time or make time when you have no time. And if anyone is interested in this, I would really encourage you to take a look at the 2018 compilation from the HBR series. It just has a lot of really good and practical tips and something for consideration for anyone who wants to go deeper. And for those that don't have time to read an HBR series, I'm going to sum up 4 essential principles that not only exist in that particular series, but if you take a look at the last 5 decades worth of literature and ideas and suggestions out there in time management, Erick is going to be able to boil those down into 4 principles. These are kind of like 4 mantras to live by. So the first principle is you can save time by being intentional as opposed to being reactive. We'll come back to this in a little bit. The second principle over 5 decades worth of time management literature is you can save time if you are present as opposed to being distracted. The third principle is that you can save time if you are empowering, especially empowering towards or with others on your team as opposed to micromanaging. And then the last principle is you can save time if you're good, not perfect. These principles, I think, resonate. They're much easier said than done in action. And so we're going to practice them a little bit by going through some specifics. But if you look at all of the time management sort of tips and strategies and literature out there over the last 5 decades, they can all be boiled down into one of these 4 principles. So I like to kind of lead with the principles as a place to start. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about principle number 1, which is to be intentional and not reactive. And what I mean by this is really thinking about how do you organize your tasks and your time in a proactive way, as opposed to letting others dictate that for you. So in order to kind of think about this, I want us to think about 2 important concepts, which is importance and urgency. And this kind of goes back to Dwight E. Eisenhower, who, in addition to being a president of the United States, was also a time management guru and shared a sort of a framework in his cabinet that became known as the Eisenhower Decision Matrix, which is, as you now see on the screen, a matrix that is a 2x2. It's trying to organize your tasks by things that are important versus not important. That's on the vertical axis. And then things that are urgent versus not urgent. And, Eisenhower argued that, everything that you do can be put into one of these 4 categories. And I think that's interesting. It's a good place to start because it does help one think about, all right, well, what might I do in, say, for example, the important and urgent category versus the not urgent and not important category. And while that exercise is helpful to do, what's most helpful around time management is to think about not only the tasks that you have, but how to categorize them into this 2x2. And then to let that quadrant help guide what your action or what your stance should be with that particular task. So we're going to go through this. If something is urgent and important. The Eisenhower decision matrix would say, let me go back. If something is urgent and important, the Eisenhower decision matrix would say, if what we should do is drop everything and do it. So for example, I was in clinic yesterday, and one of the things that happened in clinic was that I got paged for a medication refill for a patient who was at the pharmacy and had to get that medication done. And it felt to me that that thing was important, and it felt like it was urgent. And so that kind of guided me to drop everything that I was doing and just to respond and to do that. Now, most of the time when people are asking us to do things, it often feels like we just have to drop everything and to do it. And what the Eisenhower decision matrix helps us to think about is that it's really the things that are actually urgent and actually important where we should be dropping everything and just doing it. And not everything, not all tasks should fall in this category. And if they don't fall in the category, the Eisenhower decision matrix helps us to think about what are some other ways to manage those asks or to manage those tasks. So for example, if something is really important to you, but it's not urgent, aren't necessarily going to drop everything and do it right there in the moment. But what you should do is to schedule it in space and time, whether it's on a paper calendar or an Outlook calendar or some other calendar that you use. Carve out time to doing it and schedule that time, and make sure that you actually keep that time sacred and you protect it for yourself so that you can do it during that scheduled time. Now, you can always move it to a different point in the future if it feels like that time comes and something else more important or more urgent has come to replace it. But you're constantly being intentional about when you need to do something and just really carving out time and holding that time sacred to be able to do it during that scheduled time. So schedule it if it's important and not urgent. For me, one of the things that I know that I really need to schedule for myself is, for example, carving out some time to respond to an editor's request for comments or to get a paper section written. I'm always going to have things and fires that come up that feel much more urgent. And so I really have to carve out those important but not urgent things for myself and to really hold that time in my calendar. So you might ask what the other quadrants suggest. And so if, for example, a task is urgent but it's not important, there's two suggestions about how to deal with that. One suggestion is, if you're in a team with others, delegate that task to someone else on the team that might be able to do it. We don't always have the luxury of delegating tasks out to other people, but if it's really urgent, but it's not so important for you to do it, delegation is certainly a good strategy to consider. The other strategy to consider in that urgent and not important category is to have a conversation with a person that's asking you to do the task and to try to reframe, how urgent is this? And can we actually think about a way to schedule this as opposed to just dropping everything and doing it in the moment? Now, it may turn out that no matter what you say in the conversation, that the person feels like, you know what, this is really urgent that you need to do it, and you can't negotiate or have a conversation around it. But if you don't have that conversation about how urgent is this, then you're going to find yourself often doing it, which for not important urgent tasks ends up actually costing you time. So have that conversation and have the courage to ask for clarification on the person that is saying that this is really urgent, to see actually how urgent is this. The last category is the not important, not urgent things. And the suggestion or recommendation for things that fall in this category is limit this as much as possible. Things like, you know what, I'm going to just go on TikTok for 10 more minutes, or I'm going to check out Instagram, or I'm going to, go and procrastinate and read another article in the New York Times, or whatever you like to do to spend time in this space. This space is the procrastinator's dream, because you find yourself often gravitating towards this space. And the goal is, make sure that you really limit yourself in the amount of time that you spend in this category, because it takes away time from the schedule category or the do category. And so really make sure that you limit this. Now, all of this is easier said than done. And so a couple of, I think, just sort of tips and tricks as you think about considering this framework for your own time management. The first I would say is reflect for yourself on all of the tasks that you've done over the course of a day. And just for a sort of thought exercise, put all of those different tasks into one of these four different quadrants and see kind of how much of those tasks fell in one quadrant versus another. I would argue that many people will find some of these quadrants come more naturally to them than others. And so work on the quadrants that don't come so naturally to you. So for example, if you're really good at dropping everything and just doing things when you're given something, reflect on that and ask yourself, are there some things that I'm doing that I should actually be scheduling out for the future? Or should I be actually delegating those things to other people? Or should I actually be reframing the urgency for the person that's giving me the task so that I can do it at another time rather than just doing, because that really helps to move you away from, again, this reactive space to being a little bit more proactive. If you find yourself, for example, really occupied in the not urgent, not important category, think about strategies to help limit the kinds of activities and the kinds of time that you spend in that category. So again, some categories are going to come more naturally than others, and it takes practice in this. And while this is really intuitive in some ways, time and time again, when I've been consulting with people and working with people on how to better manage their time, it's often because this framework, while implicitly, I think, known, is really hard to put into action. And so it does take practice. So that's principle number one in a nutshell. And what we're going to go to next is principle number two, which is how to be present as opposed to being distracted. And this comes down to multitasking, or what I will say is the myth of multitasking, which is to say that I can get more stuff done if I'm doing lots of stuff simultaneously. And whether that's like checking email and watching a time management session, or whether that's doing sort of two things at once, we often think that we're doing more when we multitask, but the social psychologists would say that we actually are doing less when we multitask. And just for an experiment, I'm going to share with you a kind of make-believe trial. So if we were together and actually in a workshop, I would have us all take out a pen and paper, and we would do 2 speed trials of the following experiment to see what speed trial gets us the better time. So the task is for someone to take out their pen and paper and to copy down what you see on the screen, an exact replica of what you see on the screen on your piece of paper. And the goal is to replicate this as fast as you can. So it's a speed trial. Now, I'm going to give a twist to this, which is to say that when you are doing this on pen and paper, my first rule is that you have to alternate between the letters and the numbers. So rather than just copying things EIGNWOT and W's or in 17264 sequentially, you have to go back and forth. So you have to go to E and then 1, I and then 7, G and then 2, N and then 6. So our first speed trial, if we were to do this in person, would be to replicate these numbers and letters as fast as you can, but you're going to have to alternate. So I'm going to just pretend that we're doing it right now. So you're going to take out your pen and papers. I'm going to hold out my stopwatch and say go. And you're going to go E1, I7, G2, copying exactly what you see on the screen. For most people, if you were to do that alternating test, you would sort of do that and probably complete this in about 60 seconds or so. Some people faster, some people slower, but you would complete that in about 60 seconds. And we would record that trial and say that was your best and speediest time by alternating between letters and numbers and copying that replica as you see. Now, if I were to do that same trial, but this time give you the permission just to go sequentially through all the letters first, and then sequentially through all the numbers first. So EIGNWO, go through the string, and then 17264. it turns out that in that second trial, you would be able to have a speedier trial by at least 50% quicker. Most people, if they were at 60 seconds by alternating numbers and letters, they would be at about 28 seconds if you were going sequentially through, again, all of these letters and all of these numbers. And so what this sort of trial tells us is that there is some distraction of going between different tasks or things that don't necessarily match up in the pattern that we have in our brain. And by alternating letter, number, it slows us down as opposed to being consistent with a pattern that we might recognize, even though we're not totally sure that we, or even know that we are following a pattern. So we'll just hold that thought in our head for a second. But I'd like to convince you of one other thing, which is another multitasking trial that shows us that the possibility for distraction also slows us down. So in this sort of famous experiment that Ward and colleagues did in 2017, they asked people to do a pretty challenging task, which was to memorize a bunch of words. That is the figure that's on the left. We're not going to talk so much about the figure on the right, but we're going to just talk about the figure on the left-hand side and those three bars going up. So they had people memorize a bunch of words. And what they were interested in asking the participants was, how well could they memorize those words depending on the degree of distraction that might exist in a situation? And that distraction is reflected by three different scenarios that you see in these three bars labeled desk, pocket bag, and other room. And what that means is that they asked the participants to say, we'd like you to follow the instructions that we're going to give you, and then follow those instructions. And then we're going to give you a challenge, which is to memorize as many words as you can. So in the first group of participants, the participants labeled as the desk participants, they gave them the instructions to take out your phone. So take out your smartphone, and we want you to put it face down on the desk while you're doing the word memorization test. So those participants put their cell phone face down on the desk, and then they did a bunch of word memorization. That was one group of people. For the second group of people, they said, take out your phone, don't put it on the desk. We want you to put it either in your pocket where you can't see it, or put it in your bag where you can't see it. And then we're going to give you a bunch of words to memorize. And they had those participants do a bunch of word memorization. That was the second group. The third group, they said, we know that your phone is distracting. Take out your phone. Don't put it in your pocket. Don't put it in your bag. Actually, give it to us, and we're going to take your phone to a different room. And then they also gave those participants the word memorization test. In all three scenarios, what they didn't tell the participants was that their phone was never going to go off, that they controlled for that. They made sure that there was no one that was going to distract the person, whether the phone was face down on the desk versus in a pocket versus in a bag versus out of the room. The phones never went off. But what they found was that in each of the three groups actually statistically performed in different ways, and that if you had your phone on your desk where you could see it, even though it was face down, you performed the worst compared to people who put it in their pocket or in their bag versus people who had it in another room. And so what this experiment shows us is that just the possibility of being distracted or having to multitask with your phone actually leads to worse cognitive performance in a memory test. And they replicated this not just in a word memorization test, but in other tests as well, which is one of the things that was depicted on the right, which we're not going to talk about. So my question is, if you can put into the chat that sort of speed trial experiment and then this Ward experiment from 2017, what do these experiments tell us about multitasking? Yes, Saria, they did control for age in the studies. Great. Yeah, Becky, you sum it up really nicely. Multitasking doesn't save us time. And I would say that the world that we live in is not some kind of a social psychology experiment. The world that we live in is full of distraction, right? And so my sort of take home point for you is that we're not going to get rid of distractions and multitasking. I think that that is in many ways a part of the world that we live in. However, what I would say is that if multitasking or distraction is a part of our experience, there are some strategies to minimize it. We're not going to get rid of it, but there are definitely some strategies to minimize it. And especially when you're doing something that requires a cognitively demanding task, maybe it's an Excel spreadsheet, or maybe it's something that you need to be fully present for to give your best work. Think twice about multitasking as a way of trying to save you time in that task. You will ultimately get that task done quicker and with higher quality if you minimize as much distraction and multitasking as possible. And yeah, that comes like probably as a no-brainer, but when you ask people like, well, what were you doing? It's like, oh yeah, I was multitasking. My phone was going off, all the things and all the bad habits that exist. Like it's hard to reverse those. So some strategies to minimize multitasking is really practice being mindful. Like when you're in something, you're fully in it. And I would, argue that there's a lot of things that we're like half in. I'm guessing, and no judgment, no blame. I'm the same way when I'm also listening to a workshop. There's probably most of us that are multitasking in this session, and that is what that is. Like our world is dominated by multitasking. But if something's really important to you and you really want to get the full benefit, practice being mindful. Another strategy is to empty the tank before engaging in a really difficult task. And what I mean by emptying the tank is taking a breath, saying goodbye to the thing that you just came from, and being able to give yourself the permission to let go of what you were just leaving and to enter the space for the task that you have at hand, and to really be able to have that tank be full as opposed to being distracted or thinking about what you just left. And for some people, that means before joining a meeting, going, on a quick, 1 minute stretch or 1 minute, walk outside, or maybe it's just getting up and stretching, doing something that allows your mind to recenter and to let go as much as you can what you just left. If you know that you have something demanding, put your phone out of reach and on silent, and even better, if you believe the word study, put it out of the room if you really want to be fully present in something. Scheduling things as in a designated time slot, again, borrowing from the Eisenhower suggestion, scheduling tasks in a designated time slot can be really important as opposed to just trying to do them all at once. And then most importantly, move from a push to a pull mentality, which is thinking about being actually proactive as opposed to being reactive. So rather than having people push things out to you and telling you what to do, control that flow of information and task, and do it on your own schedule to the extent that you can. I find this really important when checking email. For anyone that sits, in front of a computer and has their email notifications buzzing every other second, that's a distraction. And that often, even though it feels like you're doing two things at once, when you're doing a cognitively demanding task, having those email notifications keep on popping up ultimately has you switching between one task to the next, between one task and the next. And if that time trial says anything, it's that switching between different kinds of tasks actually ends up slowing us down. All right, so that's the second principle. Third principle is how to be empowering as opposed to micromanaging. And this is particularly important for anyone who's working on a team where there's lots of different tasks going around and they're shared by other people. And so one way that I like to think about this is through this kind of metaphor called "Who's Got the Monkey?" Who's got the monkey isn't my metaphor. It was a metaphor that was actually shared in the Harvard Business Review back in 1974, if you can believe it. So for anyone who's like Gen Xer, millennial, Gen Z, like 1974 Harvard Business Review feels like it's super far away. It turns out that for many decades, this was the second most popular article in the Harvard Business Review. And the article is entitled "Managing Time, Who's Got the Monkey?" So that's kind of where this monkey metaphor is going to come from. Now, for anyone interested, I would suggest reading it. It was written in 1974, and so you can already see some of the words that are very 1974-ish. The burden of subordinates always seems to end up on the manager's back. Like subordinate and manager, sure, we still have the word manager, but like subordinate is not a word that we use anymore. So the article has some major limitations in terms of that kind of language that existed in 1974, but it does have some helpful principles. And so I want to share the monkey metaphor. So think about monkeys like a representation of different to-dos or tasks that you have. Everyone has a bunch of monkeys that they're juggling. You have a monkey in your hand, a monkey that's resting on your arm, a monkey that might be resting on your shoulder. Those monkeys represent things that you have to do. Now, when you're working in a team, it's very tempting to give other people your monkeys, to let people take care of your monkeys, to let people feed them, to nurture them, to pet them. It turns out that a very natural and human behavior is to let other people solve your monkeys for you. So think about that when we're thinking about teamwork. And so one of the observations that the authors in 1974 observed in talking with a lot of different teams, both high functioning teams and less high functioning teams, was that some teams were really good about giving their monkeys away to other people. And if you were, say, for example, a supervisor, and you had a supervisee, notice I'm going to change their kind of use of the word subordinate, but say you were a supervisor and you had a supervisee that you were working with, it's often very tempting for your supervisee to say, I don't know what to do with this issue. I need your help. And they actually give you their problem to solve. That's a very human thing to do. Think about that as that supervisee is giving you their monkey to take care of. And what happens is, especially when we're working on teams, is that it's often very tempting for other people to give you their monkeys, to give you their problems to solve. And then many of us actually end up taking on those problems and trying to solve that problem for the person, disempowering them or giving them less opportunity to solve that problem themselves. So what the observation and recommendation was in the 1974 Onken and Wass article was that we have to try to help people move up the levels of initiative. And it's very tempting for people just to hand you problems and then for you to take those problems on and to solve those problems and then to hold their monkey and to feed and take care of their monkey all by yourself. But check yourself on that temptation and make sure that you actually empower people to take their problems, solve their problems, and to do so in a graduated and more autonomous way. And so what their recommendation is that if you can move people up the level of problem solving independently, then you're going to ultimately get more time back as a supervisor or as a project manager. So what do they mean by this? So at the kind of sort of earliest level, people will give you a problem and then they'll wait until you tell them what the answer is. Try to not have people only live in that space. Rather than just waiting to give them the answer, try to say, well, what would you do in this circumstance? Or what would you do in this situation? And have them try to generate some ideas about how they might solve their problem. In level 2, you're still partnering with them quite actively in problem solving, but rather than telling them the answer, you're asking them to generate the answer for themselves. As you help them move up in initiative, and what saves you ultimately more time in the end is that if you can have them choose between different possibilities and then recommend an action, and then you sign off on it, that gives them more initiative to solve their problem. That's level 3. Taking them to a higher level of independence. If you can entrust them to take independent action, but just to advise you when they do take that action, that moves them up another level of initiative. And then the highest level of kind of independence and initiative is when people are kind of identifying their problems, solving their problems, taking action independently, and then just keeping you updated periodically to make sure that things are on track. That's the level that we want everyone to get at. And if you find yourself in a team where you have a manager or a supervisor who's really micromanaging, or if you yourself as a manager or supervisor are very tempted to micromanage, my guess is that you're often at a much earlier level and not empowering your team members to be at their kind of full potential. And so for anyone who's working with other people and in a management role, try to really empower those other team members to take as much independence as they can. It will save you time. And especially when you're sharing tasks with other people, try not to necessarily take on other people's monkeys or their to-dos, even though it may be really tempting and you can do it much quicker in the moment. In the long run, and ends up taking you much more time. Now, this approach takes investment because often the reason why we're micromanaging is because it just feels like it's easier to do in the moment. But trust me, like if you can actually spend some time empowering other people to take the initiative and not solving their problems for themselves, then in the long run, it has a more empowered team and it does end up saving you time. So that's the third principle. Last principle to take us home is how to be good, but not be perfect. And one important strategy here is a strategy called time boxing, which is to say that you actually constrain yourself in the amount of time that you give yourself for a particular task. And time boxing is all about this particular curve, which is around the amount of effort that you spend on a particular task. That's the horizontal axis. And then the actual quality or value that you have for the effort that you expend, that's on the vertical axis. And with this kind of value versus effort graph that you see, there is always a point of diminishing returns where if you spend 25 hours or 30 hours or 37 hours on a task, it may not be as high yield as if you had just spent 20 hours or 15 hours or 10 hours. And so there's always a point of diminishing returns. And what this means is that the sort of saying that, good enough is okay, and perfectionism, is kind of the pitfall for people that can't hold a mindset of good enough. That's really kind of the mindset for us to think about, which is don't let yourself be perfect. Let yourself be good enough, because at some point you're going to have diminishing returns for the project or the task that you're working on. And that doesn't come intuitively to us in healthcare settings. In healthcare settings, we all want to be like perfect. Perfectionism is a very strong undercurrent. But my suggestion is like, let good enough be good enough. And so I'm going to share an example of how good enough works for me in my calendar, in my system, and just have that be, an example of many different ways to approach this. So for me, I, often before I went to time management workshops would have this to-do list. And I'm not suggesting that to-do lists are bad or good, but for me, I had a to-do list. And I found myself putting stuff on the to-do list and then always coming back to it and adding more things. And then I felt like I can never have time to do things on my to-do list. And the problem with that for me, for my to-do list, was that the to-do list actually doesn't reflect the time that you're spending on something. It's just a way of categorizing the things that you need to do. And so one of the breakthroughs that I had for me that worked for me was to take my to-do list, tear it in half, and to actually have my calendar be my to-do list. Now, that's not going to work for everyone, but what it did for me was that it allowed me to actually carve out the to-dos in space and time on a calendar so that I could actually do them when that time came. And so, for example, in 2019, this was an example of a snapshot of one of my weeks. You'll see that in the snapshot that there were things that were clinics. And so those were things that were sort of carved out in clinics. But I also had some teaching workshops that I did, some meetings that I had, some teaching sessions that I was doing, some policy revisions that I had to do when I was a residency program director, kind of a blend of seeing patients and administrative stuff and teaching stuff. And what I did was I actually carved out on my calendar, like, here's the time that I need to do for these particular things. So you'll see for Monday, one of the things that I was doing on Monday afternoon from 1 to 5 was teaching a workshop around assessing and teaching competency-based education. I knew that I needed about an hour and a half to refresh myself and prep myself for the workshop. So I carved that time out in my calendar from 10:30 to 12 o'clock. And I really held that time knowing that I didn't want to spend that time any other way. I didn't want to be reactive to having to do that at a different place and time, but I scheduled it in my calendar. What you'll also notice is that I gave myself just 90 minutes for that. Some would say like, whoa, that's a lot of time to prep for a session. But for this particular session, I knew I needed 90 minutes. Now, could I have prepped for like 120 minutes? Sure, that would have been great. But I wanted good enough to be good enough. So I only gave myself 90 minutes for this. And this is an example of time boxing. How do you actually set a certain amount of time for the task that you need and not give yourself more time or less time, but give yourself a good estimate so that you can enact good enough as opposed to spending a lot of time preparing or prepping for it. Alternatively, I could have prepped for the session on Sunday night before, and if I had done that and not mapped it out in my calendar, I probably would have spent a good 2 hours trying to prep for the session, but I let good enough be good enough. So that is an example of time boxing. This is also an example of scheduling stuff in your calendar in that important but not urgent category. And so I found that for me, trying to take my to-do list and actually having my calendar be not only my management system for meetings, but also my management system for all of my to-dos was a helpful strategy for me to actually get stuff done and then to not always be in reactive mode. So with that, those are 4 principles of time management. I'm going to just pause now for a discussion to see if there's any questions, areas of confusion, or other tips or tricks that other people have in effective time management that would be helpful for us to share as a group in our last 5 minutes. Jacqueline, absolutely. I hope I'm pronouncing your first name correctly. We will share with you a PDF of the slides.
I think this was a really great discussion. I feel like I always had to help facilitate these back with you in the day, Eric, so I didn't really get to enjoy it as much, even though I clearly needed it. And I think the main point to take away from this is a whole like framework to change mentally. Like I really felt called out with the whole phone situation, and I do think it would make a major difference if I had the guts to go put my phone in the other room. And I think, and I want to know who's distracting themselves with New York Times articles instead of Instagram or TikTok, because I should befriend that person. That would make me feel better about what I'm distracting myself with, though. So, yeah.
And Surya, just to add some compassion to that, like these are principles that are again, like it's kind of like it's an aspiration. Always going to be working towards this. Like when I take a look at my week and say like, was I good, not perfect? Was I intentional as opposed to being reactive? You know, was I empowering versus micromanaging? Like I'm breaking these probably once a week also, or
Yeah.
multiple times a week also. And so it's always kind of the aspiration. And I like the principles because I think what your own solutions are to actually putting the principles into action is going to look different. Like what works for Surya is going to look very different, you know, for Eric. And so you shouldn't be prescriptive in this. Like I hope that no one takes away from this session of like, oh, I should just kind of do everything that I heard. Think more about the principles that you heard and what are the things that you can do to embody one of those principles to aspire towards that goal, knowing that it's always going to be a work in progress. And there's always going to be times where, gosh, yeah, the phone was in the room, and if I had put it out, I would have saved a little bit more time. If you could practice that once a week as opposed to like once a day, that would be a good start.
Yeah, starting off, that's really good. I also want to point out too, something I find myself doing a lot that I see with other people in my position. I'm a program administrator in a department in the School of Medicine, and it's really easy for us to knock the things out that we know instantly, you know, and wait on the things that I'm like, wait, this email's longer, I have to read it, you know, and I will so find myself doing that one last, even though I know it's more important than these other 5 things that I'm like, well, I know how to do these. Let me just get them off my plate. And then 2 hours passed by and I'm like, okay, even though they were easy, they still took up 2 hours. And now so that's what I mean by I really need to change like my framework there about the not being reactive, because I do that so much all the time. So yeah, it's a good reminder.
It's a really good point, because I think one of the reasons that keeps us in the reactive space is that it kind of feels good. Like it feels good when you're
Oh my God, yes, 100%.
off
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden you find yourself actually, I was in that upper left quadrant. I was just doing, as opposed to saying like, this is really important, but I need to schedule this, and try to move away from, that always just kind of reacting, doing category. Such a great observation and point. Any other points or thoughts or questions? I find that the time boxing can be helpful. I find that for me, time boxing is most helpful when I time box right before something, knowing that I actually can't try to extend the time anymore, that either I'm gonna just, it's due, or I got to jump into doing what what the project was. But the time boxing does help give you, a good rough estimate of how much time really should you spend in something. Yeah.
And Eric, do you ever self-sabotage on that?
Oh yeah, totally. I'm a perfectionist. And so I'll hit like the 90 minutes and be like, oh, but this could be so much better if I just spend 30 more minutes.
But I mean, like if someone asks to meet with you and you're like, I'll just cut into this time. Do you do that?
I'm pretty good. So there's some things where it's like I have a student meeting and it's really important that we meet. I will chip away at the time that I have blocked out. But I don't feel that guilty for telling people, actually, I can't meet during this time. There's things that I'm doing. And if you can get to that point of like saying no with, with a lot of, social skill, but saying no gently, but firmly, it really helps, because it then allows you to not chip away at the things that you really want to be doing.
Go to the mindset. It's a practice.
It's a mindset and a practice. Awesome. Well, we are at 1 o'clock, so I'll make sure that everyone ends on time and gets to your next things. Thank you so much for having me with you today.